So let's talk about radiometric resolution now. How many nuances of grey can we register? The variations in light intensity that our sensor can register. This is going to depend on a couple of things. It depends on the physical qualities of the sensor itself, the camera, as you like, or as you would have it. The sensor can pick up variations in light intensity. But preferably we want these to be linear or a good approximation to linear, but we also have to consider where they start as well. Is 0 actually no light at all, or is 0 some light just very, very weak and we can't see it? What's our maximum intensity? How strong a signal can we register? At some point, all of our equipment will become overexposed. We won't be able to register any more changes in light intensity. It'll just be too bright and burn the instrument, even depending on how bright the line actually is. But between this darkest signal and the brightest signal, how many levels of intensity can we register? The minimum and maximum could even be the same for different equipment, so that they're both equally sensitive to a minimum amount of light and both equally sensitive to a maximum amount of light, but one can register more levels of intensity between there. So here we have the continuous signal. Here we have a very high, in my illustration, this is the high resolution, lots and lots of different levels of intensity going up. Here's a cruder signal. We can't quite register as many different intensities in the light. So that's the signal that's being registered by or being sensed by our equipment, and then it is fed into, the information has to be stored somewhere. So we have to have a computer storage that can take care of those levels of intensity. And that also will influence our radiometric resolution as we see it, as the data we actually receive. So a lot of data, aerial photographs, satellite imagery, older satellite imagery, will store data using 256 bits, 256 bits, 1 byte. So we have 256 levels of intensity. More modern equipment, this starts to get a little bit more confused because they don't always match up. But then, given a standard system computer that we're using, a lot of modern systems, you're going to be receiving 16-bit data. Now, this is not actually. We'll move on a little bit now. We'll look at these levels of intensity. This is the effect that we're going to get when we change the levels of intensity. You can see that more details come through once we have a greater nuance in the data. But why was I umming and ahhing about the 16-bit data and having access to all those levels of intensity? Because at the satellites, they're not buying off-the-shelf components to put into the satellites. These pieces of equipment cost a fortune, so they're not using a standard Windows PC and shoving it in there. Rather, the data is being recorded using 12 bits for whatever reason. So this is not a standard number of bits that we can access on our computers due to the way the addressing on the hard disk. We don't get that level of fine-grained detail. We are obliged to use 8 bits at a time, and 12 is not divisible by 8. Whereas on modern satellites, they're using 12-bit data, which equates to just over 4,095 intensity values. So they can record those levels of intensity, and then when we get that data down onto our computers, the only way we can store that, we can't store that as 255 levels of intensity, or not without damaging it. So we have to store it as 2 bytes, 16-bit data, which means that we've got a lot of space taken up for nothing. But that's just that's something we have to accept. This is what modern systems, the intensity levels that modern systems use. Temporal resolution then, again, I'm going to draw the comparison to our spectral resolution in that we have this concept of where we're measuring, as in how often, what's the date at which we're going to measure, the time, the exact time we're going to measure, which would be like this central frequency, the central wavelength, the blue light, and then how long does the acquisition take? You know, what's the spread? How pure is our signal? In terms of a satellite, they're in an orbit, they're spinning around the Earth, and if they're just looking straight down, which a lot of satellites do, especially the free data, Landsat and Sentinel, they're looking straight down, and so the frequency with which they can gather data at a particular point on the Earth is determined by that orbit, amongst other things. So they keep coming back on a regular basis. Some commercial satellites are capable of angling their cameras so that they can increase their temporal resolution, so they can fly over or orbit over a particular spot on the Earth and photograph next to it by angling the camera, or down again, so they can increase their temporal resolution in that manner. When we're looking at aerial photographs, then we don't have this orbit. Then it's determined more by the program itself, the funding for the program, whether there's actually some order in place to say you must fly every week, every month, every year, and they will go up and take pictures. So that's more contingent on external influences outside of the sensor itself. Whereas the satellite, once it's up there, it's taking images. Of course, there is, depending on what frequencies we're talking about, what wavelengths we're measuring, we have the problem of weather for visible light. So as much as aircraft don't take off in storms and can't see through clouds, nor can satellites see through clouds. Certainly not in the frequencies we've been looking at. Radar data is different. They can see through clouds, so that's good. They're not bothered by weather on Earth. They can see through the clouds. But for the sort of data, the visible light and infrared data that we've been talking about, you are affected by the weather. So even if the satellite is up there to take the image, you might not get something because there's clouds in the way. So the temporal resolution then, if we look at this is an old photograph from 1961, and then the next image that I could find available from the Swedish Land Survey, certainly through the free access that we have at the university, was from 2015. So what happened in between? Well, we know actually that aerial photographs were taken. It's just the data has to be available as well. So temporal resolution may include just the availability. It might be that you have images in between, but you can't access them. Is that resolution? For you, it becomes, in terms of practical usage, it becomes temporal resolution, even though there were data acquired in between hand. This is kind of similar to the fact that you might get cloud cover. So it doesn't matter if you're up and flying or the satellite's above, the data is lost because you can't see. There's an interaction between all of these. I've spoken about this in terms for the spatial resolution. This also plays into the radiometric resolution, the spectral resolution. There's how these things work together. You need for a sensor to register a signal, it needs to gather a certain amount of light, a certain amount of energy. How do we gather enough energy? Well, we can increase the ground sampling distance, so we're gathering from a larger area. That gets us more light. We could instead, or also, perhaps, depending on what we want to do, increase or decrease our spectral resolution so that we say, well, I'm not interested in blue light, I'm interested in all visible light. So I'll do a panchromatic image. I'll just gather in all visible light, and therefore I get in more light that way from a particular area of ground. Another thing would be to play a little bit with our temporal resolution. If I can stand at one location and look for longer at the ground, I can gather more light. As long as the ground itself isn't changing, nothing's actually happening there, then I can stand there for longer and gather more light. So that's not normally an option for most remote sensing platforms. If you have a ground-based remote sensing platform, if you've got a tripod, you put the camera on the ground, you can let it stand there and tick away, gathering a long exposure. You can gather in more data that way. So, but normally for when you're flying in an aircraft or you're in a satellite, you're not standing still, you're moving around, and so your resolution, your temporal resolution is very high. You're gathering data very quickly, but that means that you're not able to gather as much light as you otherwise would be if you were standing still. So all of these things play in together and interact. But what does that actually mean in reality for us? Well, sometimes this next image coming up can be very difficult to see the changes that occur. So here's a black and white image. It's originally a color image. We're going to see the color image very soon. Look at some of the details around here. See if anything emerges when we add color to it. The ground sampling distance is the same. The pixel size is the same. I'm not going to change the level of intensities either, the intensity levels, the radiometric resolution. We're just going to introduce some color. Can we see some things appear, or did some things disappear? Sometimes color can confuse. More details can appear in a black and white image. Very difficult to see. I think, to my mind, some things changed around here, but that may be just me imagining things. This is a very tricky subject.